If you attended last year, you might remember Brian Alexander's invitation titled Universities on Fire, Higher Education in the Age of Climate Crisis, and the multifaceted roles of academia in this crisis that he described. And he made a focus to talk about how will the two main purposes of education, teaching and research, change as the world heats up. In this context, the work of Dr. Ahmed Afzaal lays out the dilemma that educators face given the current unsustainable way of life. Large-scale behavioral changes are imperative, not necessarily to save the planet, but to reduce unnecessary pain and suffering. Yet the vast majority of educators are still functioning in the normal mode, teaching the same subjects and skills year after year, even as the nature of the challenges our students will face is undergoing dramatic changes. So, given that we must fundamentally change how we live, teach, and lead, and this is what Dr. Afzal will talk about today. He's a generalist with a broad range of interests that bring together old and new modalities from around the globe in a lifelong effort to identify the best approaches for confronting the mighty and urgent crisis of our age. He's currently an associate professor at um, in the religion department at Concordia College in Minnesota. And without further ado, I invite Ahmed to take the stage. Thank you for being here.
All right, thank you.
Ahmed, I think you're mute.
Okay, it'll work. Okay, so thank you so much for coming here and for investing your most precious resources. That is your time and your attention. So I'd like to begin by posing a question. The question is as follows: how should a part relate to other parts within the same whole? Now, this is a very abstract question. But what do I mean by whole? What do I mean by parts? So I'm going to give you a concrete example. Think of one of your vital organs. It could be anything: heart, lungs, liver, kidneys. Suppose you thought of heart. Now, consider the following question: what is the nature of the relationship between the heart and the rest of your body? Ideally, you want that relationship to be characterized by cooperation. Ideally, you want that relationship to be characterized by cooperation, reciprocity, and mutual benefit. That's how a part should relate to other parts within the same whole. Because the alternative is rather undesirable. What would happen if your heart were to rebel against your own body? What would happen if, instead of collaborating with other organs for the benefit of the body as a whole, it decided to dominate and exploit other organs? What would happen if any one of your vital organs started acting as if it deserved to take whatever it wanted from the rest of the body without having to give anything back, as if it could live and thrive entirely on its own, independent of the rest of the body? Now, what is true of our vital organs is also true of our cells. Just as an organ is part of an organism's body, we too are part of a larger body. The body in question has two dimensions, for we are simultaneously part of a social whole and we are part of a biophysical whole. We are embedded in society and we are embedded in nature. Taken together, society and nature form the larger whole within which we live and move and have our being. Now, it is impossible for your heart or any other vital organ to exist without constant interaction with the rest of your body. In a similar fashion, we cannot avoid interacting with other people and with other life forms because we and they are part of the same whole. There is an inevitable flow of influence in all directions, and the pathways through which these influences flow are called relationships. So I want you to consider this automobile. If you take all the parts that make up an automobile and you neatly put them together in one place, like so, you won't get the automobile. Instead, you will only get a bunch of parts. So what is missing? The answer is relationships. These parts have to be organized so that they are in appropriate relationship with each other. And so it is the web of such relationships that gives rise to the whole. Let's go a step further. When we consider our relationships with other people and with other life forms, it turns out that these relationships are even more real in some ways than we are. It's not that we come into existence first and then we enter into these relationships. Rather, it's the relationships themselves that make it possible for us to exist at all. Without them, we are literally nothing. So, without the web of relationships that represent society, we could not have come into being. We are what we are by virtue of our relationships, past and present, with other people. The same goes for the web of relationships that represent nature, without which we could not have come into being. We are what we are by virtue of our relationships, past and present, with other life forms and with land, air, and ocean. We call this phenomenon interdependence. So now, let me return to the original question. I said, how should a part relate to other parts within the same whole? I have already answered that question, but I'm going to repeat it one more time. There are two main paradigms for such relationships. The parts can relate to each other on the basis of cooperation and reciprocity in ways that are mutually beneficial and serve the long-term needs of the whole. Or some of the parts can become selfish and seek to dominate and exploit other parts, as if they were entitled to take whatever they wanted without giving anything back. Let's call these two paradigms collaboration and domination. Now, the critical difference between the collaboration paradigm and the domination paradigm is whether both parties in a given relationship benefit more or less equally, or if one party benefits at the expense of the other. When the relationship is such that one side is taking a lot more than it gives back, we call that exploitation, which is a hallmark of the domination paradigm. Now, the ability to exploit presupposes that one side is able to exercise power over the other, leading to a situation based on domination on one side and submission on the other side. So let me say a few things about the domination paradigm. It seems clear that domination and exploitation will only benefit some parts of the whole while harming the rest. And it is fairly obvious that the whole cannot maintain its own integrity if its various parts are at odds with each other. This implies that any benefit that the dominant parts might gain will be temporary, since their own existence depends on the well-being of the whole, which in turn depends on the well-being of all of its parts. In other words, when one part of a whole dominates and exploits another part, it is also putting itself in jeopardy. So you may want to ask, why does the domination paradigm even exist? Well, the answer is pretty straightforward. Within a given whole, when some parts seek to dominate and exploit other parts, they gain a definite advantage. So think of a social system in which one group of people has acquired an advantage in terms of wealth and power, and they have done that by dominating and exploiting another group of people. Examples of such social systems, you can easily think of those. I'm thinking of slavery and colonialism. Or we can think of how a large segment of humankind has acquired a similar advantage in terms of wealth and power by dominating and exploiting other life forms and their habitats. It is precisely this advantage that makes the domination paradigm so attractive and so desirable to those who are able and willing to embrace it. There is another reason. Adopting the domination paradigm leads to a self-reinforcing process that can be spectacularly successful in the short term. This option, meaning the option of adopting the domination paradigm, is attractive because it improves our access to wealth and power. This improved access then increases our ability to dominate and exploit, which gives us access to even more wealth and power, which further increases our ability to dominate and exploit, and so on. Now, the spectacular triumphs of the domination paradigm are undeniable. For example, colonialism has been largely responsible for jump-starting the historical process that accelerated the progress and generated the prosperity that we associate with the modern era. In many ways, the expectation of progress and prosperity is the defining feature of modernity. Similarly, the efficient exploitation of natural resources, such as oil, has made possible a great technological revolution that has, in turn, brought about countless improvements in the human condition, including the fact that you and I, we are communicating right now in real time, even as we are physically separated across thousands of miles. This is the result of the domination paradigm. And yet, the domination paradigm is ultimately self-defeating. The benefits it brings to some segments of humankind are transient and short-lived, and they come at a tremendous cost to both people and the planet. Essentially, the domination paradigm allows some parts of the whole to gain a tremendous advantage in terms of wealth and power, while harming other parts and jeopardizing the integrity of the whole. When all is said and done, it becomes clear that the domination paradigm produces no winners. Everyone loses. Even those who seem to be the winners in the short term have to pay a hefty price in the form of a deep-seated unhappiness and dissatisfaction, resulting from a pervasive sense of alienation and lack of meaning. But this reality has to be forgotten or ignored or never recognized in order for the domination paradigm to appear like a clever strategy. In fact, it is as dumb as a malignant tumor thinking that metastasizing throughout the body will make it the winner. There are no winners in the domination paradigm, only the illusion, a temporary illusion of winning. So how do parts relate to the whole? I have suggested that there are two main paradigms. There's the collaboration paradigm and the domination paradigm. Now, I want to add one more thing. These two paradigms are correlated with two more or less distinct ways of thinking. The logic that underlies the collaboration paradigm, I'm going to call that relational logic, and the one that underlies the domination paradigm, I'll call it the atomistic logic. So the logic that underlies the collaboration paradigm, it can and does recognize the individual parts as such, but it views them in terms of contexts and relationships. This logic prioritizes the whole at every level, taking into account the fact that the meaning of an individual part depends on its relation to other parts, and that this meaning can change from one context to another. I'm calling this a relational logic because it is the logic of interconnectedness and interdependence. In contrast, the logic that underlies the domination paradigm takes an atomistic approach. It focuses on the individual parts, and it views them in isolation. It tries to understand each part without reference to context or relationships. This is the logic of analysis, control, and manipulation. Now, it's important to remember that both of these ways of thinking, or both forms of logic, are valid. However, they lead to different consequences. And some of those consequences are more desirable in the short term, and some are more desirable in the long term. So it does make a difference whether we are prioritizing the relational logic and the collaboration paradigm, or the atomistic logic and the domination paradigm. Ideally, relational logic is supposed to play a supervisory role because it provides a broader perspective. It considers parts, and it also considers the whole, and it looks at the parts in terms of context and relationships. The atomistic logic provides a limited and narrow viewpoint by focusing on individual parts and disregarding relationships and contexts, and by downplaying interconnections and interdependence. What we call modernity, modern era, the distinctive way of being that describes our lives. Modernity has reversed the natural order by empowering the atomistic logic and therefore the domination paradigm. For the record, I am drawing upon the work of Ian McGilchrist. no time for details. The next thing I want to introduce, if you might be saying, well, am I presenting a strong binary here between relational logic and atomistic logic, between two paradigms? So I would suggest we can address that concern by thinking of the two paradigms of collaboration and domination as the opposite ends of a spectrum. So ideally, we want to be as close to the collaboration end of the spectrum as possible, which gives all parties the best opportunity for happiness and well-being in the long term, even though it doesn't produce the sort of comforts and conveniences to which we, denizens of modernity, have become so accustomed. Now, the collaboration paradigm is the only way for both the parts and the whole to thrive indefinitely, and not just in the short term. However, when we lose our trust in a generous God, or in a benevolent cosmos, or in a close-knit community, we become fearful that our needs will remain unmet. Fear makes us vulnerable to greed and selfishness, and even aggression and violence. As a result, we are tempted to acquire as much as we can by any means necessary, and to hoard it just for ourselves, leaving little or nothing for everyone else. That's when the domination paradigm starts making perfect sense. It becomes the universal ideal towards which everyone is supposed to aspire. Now, other people look at our apparently successful strategy, and they are tempted to adopt it as well. Sometimes out of greed and selfishness, rooted in the fear of not having enough to survive, and sometimes in an attempt to overcome the humiliation of having been dominated, exploited, oppressed, and victimized. Now, since modernity prioritizes atomistic logic and the domination paradigm, and we are all denizens of modernity, we need to appreciate the fact that we are all enjoying the fruits of the domination paradigm. Some of us are enjoying a lot more than others, but we are all partaking of those fruits, even as we are also enduring the harmful consequences of that same paradigm. That is the paradox of modernity. It creates immense wealth and prosperity. At the same time, it creates an existential vacuum and a crisis of unhappiness. On the one hand, the lives and livelihoods of the vast majority of the global human population have become entangled, deeply entangled in the domination paradigm. In fact, we are dependent, our lives and livelihoods are dependent on the continuation of the domination paradigm. On the other hand, the same paradigm has also caused and continues to cause an immense amount of suffering and destruction to people and other living beings, to the point where it has unleashed the sixth great mass extinction and is now threatening to render the entire planet uninhabitable. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is economic growth, and I'm talking about economic growth as an example or as a representative manifestation of the domination paradigm, because the dual nature of the domination paradigm, that it creates wealth and prosperity as well as misery and dissatisfaction, and in the end there are no winners. That dual nature of the domination paradigm can be clearly seen in the phenomenon called economic growth. Modern society is obsessed with economic growth to the point of insanity. And that is not an exaggeration, since insanity is when an individual loses touch with the real world, falls into delusional thinking, and behaves in self-destructive ways. These characteristics accurately describe modern society's never-ending pursuit of economic growth as an end in itself. It is a form of insanity. The nature of economic growth. The metaphor I like to use is that economic growth is comparable to the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And you can extend that to the entire domination paradigm as well. On the one hand, economic growth produces progress and prosperity, at least for some groups of people, for some amount of time. That's the benevolent aspect. That's Dr. Jekyll in action. Economic growth does that by increasing production and consumption, which increases population and living standards, and is accompanied by increasing social and technological complexity. And these are all desirable things. But economic growth has a malevolent aspect as well, represented by the evil Mr. Hyde. It reduces the integrity of the natural world. It interferes with the functioning of the Earth's life support system, and it jeopardizes the very habitability of the planet. The ecocide we are witnessing in the world is due to the shenanigans of Mr. Hyde, which in turn cancels out all the great achievements of Dr. Jekyll. The point to remember here is that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, if you are familiar with the story, they are not two people. They are one and the same, and there is nothing we can do about that. The phenomenon that brings about progress and prosperity is the same phenomenon that destroys the natural environment. We want to maintain economic growth all over the world, but we also want to protect biodiversity and stop climate change. Yet the two goals are incompatible. And any economic theory that fails to recognize this fact is simply delusional. Now, whatever goes up must come down. Economic growth and technological progress are not the type of phenomena that can go on forever. The short-term advantages of the domination paradigm make it extremely attractive, even addictive, but only so long as the beneficiaries can postpone the cost or export it to other parts of the world. Even though the domination paradigm is a self-reinforcing process, it is neither stable nor eternal. That's because we live in a finite world with finite resources and finite capacities. There is a limit to how much we can dominate and exploit other people and their lands, and other life forms and their habitats. There is a limit to how much we can take without giving back. Once we come near that limit, the law of diminishing returns sets in. The harms we cause start to outweigh and outpace any benefits we generate, making it harder and harder to gain any additional wealth and power by means of more exploitation and more domination. That's when the system starts to face crisis after crisis, as it enters a stage that we call collapse. Now, we have now reached a point where we can neither postpone nor export the negative consequences of the domination paradigm. The cost is rising faster than the benefits. The party was fun while it lasted, at least for some people, but the party is now effectively over. We are at the beginning of a long period of decline and disruption in our habitual ways of life. The processes of modernity's final descent have already started. This situation, this state of decline, disruption, and collapse. It is relentless, irreversible, and unstoppable. So now, let me say something about sustainability in relation to this concept of collapse. Collapse is the opposite of sustainability. When something is sustainable, that means it is capable of maintaining itself in the long term or into the indefinite future. When something is unsustainable, that means it won't last very long, that it is going to break down and fall apart. Now, over the last 50 years or so, we have talked a lot about sustainability, about how to make our economy sustainable, how to make businesses sustainable. We have talked about sustainable lifestyle and sustainable food and sustainable fashion. We have written books and given speeches and attended conferences. We have taught courses. We have given lectures. We have been to protests and marches, and most of us would probably consider ourselves activists for the cause. The difficulty is that we have been trying to achieve the holy grail of sustainability within the domination paradigm, which is by definition unsustainable. On the other hand, shifting away from the domination paradigm and moving towards the collaboration paradigm is no easy task either. It's hard enough for individuals and many times harder for societies to make any progress in that direction. Now, since I've already used the C word, collapse, let me add a few details just to explain what I mean. First thing to note is that there are many synonyms. So if you don't like the word collapse, you can always use one of these alternatives, such as the great simplification, the great unraveling, the slow death of modernity, and the end of the world as we know it. But regardless of how you name the phenomenon, what we are talking about is not a single spectacular event. Rather, it is a process that unfolds over decades. It doesn't proceed at a constant speed, and its manifestations are not uniform everywhere. Everyone is not affected at the same time or in the same way, even though ultimately no one escapes. In fact, collapse is the natural and logical outcome of the domination paradigm. If we understand what the domination paradigm is, and if we appreciate how the modern world is built upon that paradigm, then there is no reason for us to be surprised or shocked when the structures of modernity start to break down. So, I hope you can appreciate that I'm not trying to make you feel depressed or discouraged. I definitely don't want you to give up. What I'm trying to do is to make the case that we cannot reach the holy grail, right, sustainability, without replacing the domination paradigm with the collaboration paradigm. And that requires replacing the atomistic logic with relational logic. However, because much of the modern world, if not all of it, is dependent on the continuation of the domination paradigm, there is no way to reach sustainability from where we are without going through the collapse of the modern world. So even though this organization is dedicated to the advancement of sustainability, I suggest that it needs to start talking about the inevitable collapse of the modern world as well, which I believe has already started, and about the need for preparing ourselves, our students, and our fellow citizens for what's coming. Now, our efforts to reach sustainability were really aimed at avoiding the consequences of unsustainability. And we can still do a lot to minimize the impacts of some of those consequences. However, I think that at this point, preventing the collapse of the modern world is not on the menu. The choice is no longer between sustainability and the collapse of organized global society. Rather, the choice we are facing is between a collapse that is violent, chaotic, and unjust, and one that is relatively peaceful, relatively well managed, and relatively just. Now, with all this in mind, what should be the role of education? In the past, it somehow made sense to many of us that the fundamental aim of education is to continuously increase human progress and prosperity. We thought that what made education meaningful was its contribution to economic productivity, and that the most important values for society and for individuals was efficiency and innovation. Given these beliefs, educators have typically supported and reinforced the domination paradigm, sometimes knowingly and sometimes unconsciously. And we have done this sometimes or very often by simply thinking and acting in accord with the individualistic or atomistic logic that underlies the domination paradigm. And that is the hallmark of modernity. Now, such beliefs were always problematic, but now they are anachronistic as well. They are hopelessly out of date. Helping students become productive members of the economy cannot possibly be our highest goal or the best use of our time and talents. We need to rethink and re-envision the proper aim of education in the age of collapse. So where do we go from here? At the moment, we are looking at incredible suffering and destruction in the coming years and decades as ecosystems unravel and institutions break down. Some of that suffering and destruction is unavoidable, but some of it may still be avoidable provided we can act with sufficient foresight and wisdom and compassion. I believe the world needs a different type of leadership than what we have at the moment. We need a new type of leadership that can guide the population with the aim of minimizing the harm and reducing as much suffering and destruction as possible. So, probably the best definition of leadership that I've come across is the one that describes leadership as taking responsibility for the whole. Taking responsibility for the whole. I can assure you that the world of politics and the world of business will not be able to produce leaders who are willing to rise to this unimaginably difficult challenge. Instead, I have become convinced that the responsibility for such leadership now belongs to people like you and me. That is to say, educators in the broadest sense of the word. Our work begins in our classrooms and our institutions, but it must not end there. If we are serious about exercising real leadership, then we need to continuously expand our zone of concern and our zone of influence. And that means we need to rethink and re-envision the responsibility of educators in the age of collapse. So I will leave you with these two questions to ponder. Thank you for your time, for your attention. And I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. And I think that we have time for a couple of questions. And I see Oshwani has raised his hand. So, Oshwani, come to the stage and let us know your question.
Hello, folks. And thank you. Fabulous presentation. I'm looking forward to reading your book. Uh, Question I have for you is how? You asked me who and when. Tell me how. How do educators need to change what they teach? How do we break from the dominant paradigm? That's what we're trying to figure out, all of us. That's why we're here.
Right. The short answer is I don't know. And there is a longer answer because I do know a few things. And I write about some of them in the book, and there's another book I'm working on. But in general, this is we are in uncharted territory, right? This is an unprecedented situation. There are some local examples that we can draw upon from the past, but we have never faced such a thing at such a large scale, with such speed and with such scope. So we don't have a situation where anyone knows that anyone has sure, definite answers. And so what I'm hoping, my hope has been by writing this book and making these presentations, is that we can stimulate a conversation and we can allow community wisdom to emerge. People talking to each other and coming up with novel answers. This is not something that one person can do, but it is something that it's sort of a that's what they call emergence, when you have a completely new and unprecedented situation. You have to think outside the box, and everybody has their blind spots, everybody has their own limitations. But when lots of people come together and they engage and you have the right atmosphere, very unexpected things can emerge. And that's what I'm relying on. That once educators, and again, I'm using the word educator in the broadest sense, I don't just mean faculty members or school teachers, anyone who is in a position or who regularly instructs or guides others is an educator. I include parents and community organizers and religious leaders. Is that once they understand that it's really up to us, nobody's going to come and save us, and the existing leadership will not help. Once we know that part, we can then start talking about how to proceed. Now, again, I do have ideas about what to do and how to proceed, but I don't think that my personal take is going to work for everybody, or that everybody will even agree with it. And so that's why I think it's a community project. I hope that helps.
It does. Thank you. I'd love to have a deeper discussion with this. And Brada, if you're going to do breakout rooms, maybe we could have one with Ahmed in it, so we can continue this conversation.
Absolutely. So, are there any other questions for the full group at this time? I'm not really seeing them in the chat. I do see some comments of how from Terry specifically on the book Ministry of the Future. This is a book that we also read every year in our the Ultimate Cli-Fi book club that will start again in August. So if you're more interested in having that conversation more, I also encourage you to check out that event. And with that, I will invite Sandra to take us to the next part of the event. Thank you, Ahmed, so much for starting our forum and all of these very important things for us to consider. So, Sandra, I invite you to join us here on the stage.